Ronnie, thank you. Rennie, thank you. I think mine was the only one today that was prefaced with the words, "Oh no!" I think I know where we're headed here. In fact, your applause is a very sweet sound. It is for anyone who ever speaks publicly or is ever introduced, but my acute sense of hearing is picking something else up right now. It's coming from about 160 miles away from here, where I grew up in Bayside, Queens. And there you go, Bayside, baby. Now, if you listen real carefully right now, you can hear laughter. And I'm not talking about chuckles. I mean raucous, rolling in the aisles hysteria. They are howling at the thought that the worst athlete in the history of PS 205 in Bayside can possibly be inducted into a Hall of Fame that includes Sandy Koufax, Mickey Mantle, Vin Scully, Ron Darling, Art Shamsky, members of my beloved 1969 Mets, and me. So it kind of brings to mind a famous line from an old comedian, George Gobel, who once famously said, "Do you ever think the whole world was a tuxedo and you're a pair of brown shoes?" George Gobel is here in spirit tonight, but I think my story is somewhat similar to probably any of yours in this room about how we became baseball fans. Our dads, maybe our moms as well, but I was no different. My dad was a huge Yankee fan. And before I knew the ABCs, because my dad would drill this into me as a little kid, I knew at his request, number 1, Bobby Richardson, second base. Number 7, Mickey Mantle, center field. Number 8, Yogi Berra, catcher. Now that last one is significant here. And again, Rennie, there's still time to take this induction back if you want. The first baseball game I ever really remember paying attention to with even a modicum of rooting interest was Game 7 of the 1960 World Series between the Yankees and the Pittsburgh Pirates. That's the game that ended with Bill Mazeroski's home run in the bottom of the ninth inning at Forbes Field to give the Pirates the World Championship. Well, number 8, Yogi Berra, the catcher, just happened to be playing left field that day. And I probably saw that highlight a half a dozen times over the next couple of weeks. And every time I did, I saw Yogi going back to the left field wall, and the ball sails over his head for a home run. And I'm thinking, and I'll cut myself this much slack, I was 6 years old at the time, I'm thinking, man, it is tough being a catcher. You gotta chuck off your mask, get rid of all that equipment, run as far and as fast as you can, and he still would have caught the ball if it stayed in the park. Yeah, this is the brain surgeon you're putting into the Hall of Fame tonight. So, in 1961, my dad took me to a lot of games at Yankee Stadium, and seriously, could you imagine falling in love with baseball in 1961 when Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris waged their epic home run battle? And eventually, of course, Maris hit 61 to beat Babe Ruth's record of 60. But, you know, that cemented in my mind the fact that my life was now baseball-centric. Nothing happening in the outside world meant anything other than baseball. And so that next year, in 1962, the Mets came into existence. And being a typically narcissistic, now 8-year-old, I thought, hey, this is really cool. Now that I'm a baseball fan, they're creating a team just for me. I had a proprietary interest now in the New York Mets, one that has lasted really the better part of 6 decades. And it wasn't long before I started to germinate this dream of becoming a broadcaster. And I guess, Bob, your stories are very similar to mine. We call our own games. We play in punch ball or stick ball or whatever. And, you know, there I was calling my own game in Bob Murphy's voice. And the thought that years and years later I would share a broadcast booth with Bob Murphy was beyond surreal. It did become real. And I still kind of pinch myself to this day when I think about how fortunate I've been to have gotten to that point. But 1969 is the year that changed my life, and maybe some of you as well. Although, I don't know, Ronnie, I'm starting to think this is a road game here, because there's a lot of Yankee representation, and I'm looking around. Is Art here? I know Art Shamsky is going in tonight, but I guess something must have come up because Art is not here. But that's me and you, buddy, right now, as far as Mets representation goes. Thank you very much. But, you know, when I think of 1969, I just think of, quite frankly, my life changing. And it was, in a lot of ways, for a lot of reasons. And I'm disappointed Art's not here, because he actually had something to do with that. A couple of years, or a couple of days, really, after the Mets took over first place in the National League East, the Mets won a doubleheader in Pittsburgh to increase their lead over the Cubs. They won those games 1-0, both games. And in both games, the Mets starting pitchers, Jerry Koosman and Don Cardwell, drove in the only runs. Well, I was going to say all these nice things about Art, that wouldn't have happened if Art was playing that night, because he probably would have driven in 2 or 3 runs and no one would have remembered that doubleheader. But Art did not play in those games because he was observing the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. That made a pretty big impression on me as a 15-year-old who had been bar mitzvahed and saw Sandy Koufax not pitch Game 1 of the 1965 World Series for the Dodgers because it was Yom Kippur. But, you know, for Art to do that in the middle of a pennant race, I thought, this is pretty serious stuff. And so he inspired me. He inspired me to take off of every other Jewish holiday that I possibly could. Now, let me tell you something. Our food, it's so-so, but we got a lot of holidays. And I was able to get out of a lot of school thanks to that. And so what 1969 really did was change my life, because it made me believe that anything was possible, including becoming a major league broadcaster. And it was only going to be for the Mets. I mean, I never even envisioned myself broadcasting games for any other team. It had to be the Mets. But even in those stickball and punchball games at PS 205, when I was tripping over my own 2 feet, the thought of working in a booth one day with Bob Murphy and Ralph Kiner was beyond surreal. Just try to calculate the odds against that. And they were 2 such completely different people. Bob Murphy was a Marine. To see him, you wouldn't think so. Bob wasn't a big guy at all. And he never came off, at least publicly, as really tough and gruff, although he was when you worked with him. He was a taskmaster in the booth. But let me tell you something, Bob Murphy, as a Marine, and I didn't know this until recently when I checked up on him a little bit, Bob was actually a weather observer and navigator for the Marine Corps, which now makes a lot of sense, because those of us who grew up in New York listening to Bob describe those puffy cumulus clouds overhead, now I get it. I mean, that was his Marine training, you know? So when I found out about that, all these thoughts started bouncing up and down in my mind, and all I could hear in my head was Bob Murphy actually saying in the middle of World War II, "It's a beautiful day for battle here in Okinawa." Because that's what Bob was. Everything was upbeat. He could be in the middle of the war in the Marines, and he would find something pleasant to say about it. In the booth, though, he was the Marine in the booth, all right, because he had to have it done his way. He wanted to do it the way he was taught to do it, and there was a generation gap between the 2 of us. And if you deviated even a little bit from his preferred script and his preferred image of what a Major League Baseball announcer should be, you would hear it from him. And that's why one of the most poignant memories, really, that I have in my career was towards the very end of Bob's time with the Mets, which sadly was less than a year before he died. You have to understand about Murph, he was driven crazy by the epitome of stuffed shirts, M. Donald Grant, the longtime board chairman of the Mets, who frankly made Murph fear for his job every year in the early days of the Mets, so much so that Mrs. Payson, the original owner, really had to save him from being fired. It had to come down to Mrs. Payson saving him. And so Murph would, look at any young guest in his broadcast booth as a potential replacement, and that would make him nervous. But towards the end of his career and his life, he grew more comfortable with his place and his legacy in Mets history. And I had been alternating between TV and radio in those days with the Mets, and I was never quite comfortable back then with how I sounded or really felt about my work on radio, because it's so completely different than television. TV is easy, man, compared to radio. I mean, you've got to just describe everything on radio. And I remember after we went to a between innings break, I said to Murph, I said, geez, I don't know if I'm ever going to get the hang of this. I just don't feel right yet on radio. And Murph did something that I never thought I'd experience. He just patted me on the thigh. He says, no, you should feel really good about your baseball. And that's one of the warmest things anybody ever said to me, because I know what it took for Murph to get to that point. And to be accepted by him was a dream come true, really. And for Ralph, it was the same thing. Ralph was completely different, though. I saw Murph get mad. The closest I ever came to seeing Ralph get mad, and I've seen a waitress drop multiple drinks from one tray in Ralph Kiner's lap. Now you'd think, if that's going to get anybody ticked off, that would do it, right? Well, Ralph liked to smoke a cigar in the booth during the game, and he came from Southern California, and we're doing a game one night out in San Diego, and somebody comes into the booth of particular authority and says, Mr. Kiner, I'm sorry, but there's a state ordinance, and you're just going to have to put that cigar out. And Ralph just shoots him a look and says, you know, this used to be a great state. That was it. That was it. That's as angry as I ever saw him get. So to have had the opportunity to work with those two, Bob Murphy and Ralph Kiner, was a dream that was too surreal to believe that came true. But I can't accept this award without acknowledging all of the partners I've worked with in baseball. I did a lot more television before I did radio. And, you know, Ron, you probably pitched to Fran Healy once or twice. He couldn't have caught you more than once or twice, right? Well, you know, Healy was one of my first partners on television. And that guy could plug 3 sponsors on a ground ball to shortstop. I've never seen anything like it. My favorite one was one night, one of the Mets hierarchy came into the booth, this is a TV game now, and gives us a box of Krispy Kreme donuts. It's important to know what company, Krispy Kreme donuts. I go, you know, I got to say something on the air to acknowledge this. So I said, hey, Fran, isn't this great? So-and-so just came into the booth and gave us a big, beautiful box of, and Healy panics, and he takes his hand and he puts it over my mouth and over my microphone, and he's pointing frantically out to the signage in left field. And as I say, we got a beautiful box of, Healy jumps in and goes, Dunkin' Donuts! So, you know, when you hear me talking about any of the sponsors that I feel a particular kinship to on our broadcast, trust me, it's genuine. And if you think it was surreal working with Bob and Ralph, how about working on television with Tom Seaver? You know, Tom certainly become a friend over the years, and Tom and Nancy are very much in my heart tonight, because we all know Tom's going through some tough times right now. But there was nothing tough about him making the transition from the field to the broadcast booth. Ronnie, you could appreciate this, and Ron, so could you, and Goose, you too. I couldn't believe this. I'm doing a game in St. Louis with Seaver. He called a balk before the umpire did. There's a pitch, and now Tom's talking, and now the pitcher's getting ready to throw the next pitch, and while Tom's talking, he interrupts himself. He goes, oh, that's a balk. And then 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, that's a balk, said the umpire. Now, you talk about baseball acumen, that's pretty sharp right there. So, you know, between Bob and Ralph and then Seaver, I could have retired right then. But every partner that I've worked with, you know, has a special piece, really, of appreciation from me. One in particular, certainly as much a friend as a colleague as Gary Cohen. We're certainly kindred spirits. And quite frankly, I learned more about how to broadcast baseball in the 2 years that Gary and I worked together on radio than I did before or since. Because just watching him work on radio was an eye-opening education. There's no detail too small to be mentioned. The play doesn't end when the hitter reaches base or a run scores. You've got to describe the crowd. You've got to describe what else is going on, perhaps in either dugout, and I'll always be indebted for Gary to that. And I've had so many great partners over the years. Josh Lewin, most recently, before he was replaced last year by Wayne Randazzo, who's one of the great up-and-coming young broadcasters. Tom McCarthy. Wayne Hagan, I don't know how many of you know Wayne. When you were in Oakland, Goose, was Wayne there? Wayne is a guy who is one of my all-time favorite people because you just can't find a nicer man. New York was a bit of an adjustment for Wayne, and I really didn't help because I would drop in playfully. I mean, this is New York, right? So I would drop in a Yiddish phrase every now and then on the air. You know, Sean Green hit his first home run for the Mets, and as it went over the wall, I said, instead of "there it goes," I went "sei gesund." And you know, every once in a while, I would drop in a Mazel Tov or an Aya Bruck, and I could see Hagan scratching his head. What the hell's he talking about? But you know, he was such a great partner. He wanted to get in on this. So the Mets are playing the Braves one day, and Chipper Jones, great player, Hall of Famer, has to leave because of an injury. And Martin Prado comes in to replace him. Now, Martin Prado, a few years ago, was an outstanding player before the injuries took over. So Hagan, announcing the departure of Chipper Jones, says, well, Chipper Jones had to leave this game today, but Martin Prado's coming in to play third base, and he's no ordinary schmuck. Yeah, that one was on me. You know, I took the blame. The phone rang in the booth from our executive producer maybe 15 seconds later. And our producer, engineer Chris Matchkowski, sitting there going, yeah, that's what he said. Yeah. Don't worry, I'll tell him. We'll work it out. And to his credit, Phil Mushnick, who writes the TV radio column for the New York Post, he heard that and he played it perfectly. Next column in the Post, he said, memo to Wayne Hagan. Not all Yiddish expressions are clean. So that was great, as have been all of the partners that I've worked with. And I've been blessed to work with some great people in management as well who have to hire us and have to have faith with us or in us. And one of them is here tonight, Tim Shell. Please, Tim, just stand up and wave. Tim is the news and program director at WCBS Radio. He's a very powerful man. He can pull the plug anytime. So can Rennie. I haven't seen him yet. So I got a few quick things I want to get in before I say goodnight. And that is just that anybody in our line of work who does play-by-play are often asked for, you know, your greatest memories. What calls, what games do you remember? And there are easy ones that come to mind for me. The game where Mike Piazza hit the home run 10 days after 9/11 is one that so far transcends baseball that it's only in the last few years that I've really, really come to understand what that game meant to the psyche, not only of the Mets and their fans, but to this city. And it's recalled every September, and it seems that home run only gets bigger and bigger. Now, I was doing TV that night, and I didn't think it was much of a call. You know, people still tell me, oh, I really enjoyed that call that night. All I really said was, home run, Mike Piazza, because it's TV call. You don't describe as much. But we were also told not to emote. The executives who ran MSG Network, who were televising the game at the time, told us before that night, this is going to be a game unlike any other you've ever done. So just keep everything low key. Don't get as excited as you normally would. So as Piazza hit the ball and it's on its way out of the park, I said, this one has a chance. Well, it went about 450 feet. And our former equipment manager and traveling secretary, whenever that call was anywhere within earshot, he'd say, and he spoke with a little lisp too, he'd say, hey, Howie, got a chance. You think it had a chance? It went to the Whitestone Bridge. Had a chance. So yeah, I'll always remember that one. I'll always remember, you saw it here a little while ago, Johan Santana's no-hitter. Never thought I'd see that. Still not sure I saw it, and I'm sure Carlos Beltran will have something to say about it, because had that game been played today and there were replay involved. Well, Carlos Beltran, who was playing for the Cardinals that night, hit a line drive down the left field line. Did it really catch the chalk, Ronnie? I'm still not. Yeah, it caught the chalk. So, all right. So maybe it would have been, maybe it wouldn't have been. But that was the single greatest minute of disbelief in my broadcast career, because I had long come to the conclusion that Mets never going to pitch a no-hitter, and that's the end of that. It took me about a minute before I could finally even find the presence of mind to say, put it in the books. But that's because of what I learned from Gary Cohen, that there was a whole lot of other stuff going on right after strike three that you had to describe, and only after about a minute did put it in the books even fit. And then, of course, there was Jerry's Familia striking out Dexter Fowler to clinch the National League pennant for the Mets in 2015. You know those stickball and punchball games I talked about that we'd call ourselves while we played them? I can't tell you how many times as a little kid I would call, "The Mets win the pennant, the Mets win the pennant." Well, let me tell you something. To say that in real time as a representative of the New York Mets broadcasting their games, I still get shivers down my spine thinking about how incredibly fortunate I was to be in the booth at Wrigley Field that night. I'm holding out for one more big call, though, and hopefully that'll come within the next few years. But as emotional as I can get talking about big calls, and there's only one other thing, and really three other things, that are here tonight that can make me emotional. And I want to introduce them to you. My wife, Barbara, my daughters, Alyssa and Chelsea. Stand up. For once, listen, stand up. And there's one very important reason, apart from the obvious, why I introduced them tonight, and that is because all of us in here love baseball, and it's been a part of our lives forever. But let me tell you something. The baseball life is tough. In fact, to live the baseball life really is to have no life, because spring training starts and you are consumed for the next 6 or 7 months by whatever it is that the team you're associated with is doing. And so in that time span, you know, first holiday up is what? Memorial Day, and then comes July 4th, and then comes Labor Day, and everybody's having barbecues and picnics and parties, and the wives are off to fend for themselves. And especially when I was doing hockey as well as baseball, my wife over there, that's the Hall of Famer, because she had to raise these two beautiful girls basically on her own. And I know many of you who have made your lives in baseball in this room have the same experiences, and I'm sure you speak with and feel the same reverence for your spouses and significant others that I do for Barbara, Alyssa, and Chelsea. If not for them, I'm not standing here. So thank you so much.